Good afternoon and welcome to this episode of Bright Blue TV, in which we will be discussing, does the monarchy matter? This year, Her Majesty the Queen celebrates her Platinum Jubilee, the first monarch in the history of the UK to do so. After 70 years of guiding the country through wars, recessions, and even a pandemic, the Queen reigns as the grandmother of the nation. While the Jubilee year is an opportunity to look back at the highs and lows of the past 7 decades, the monarchy is also looking to its future. The Queen has expressed her sincere wish that when the Prince of Wales accedes to the throne, the Duchess of Cornwall should use the title of Queen Consort, an unthinkable decision in the years immediately following the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. However, despite the Queen's unrivaled personal popularity, the monarchy has been rocked by recent scandals and controversies, including the sex abuse allegations against the Duke of York and the departure of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex from the firm. When the younger generations take over, the monarchy will doubtless reform to meet the sensibilities of a new age. But can the ancient institution live long over us? Or will the coming decades see an increasing clamour towards its abolition and the birth of a British Republic? So, joining me to discuss this are the Professor of Government and the Constitution in the School of Public Policy at UCL, Robert Hazel, the Chief Executive of Republic, Graham Smith, and the Senior Lecturer in Early Modern European History at the University of Winchester and the Editor-in-Chief of the Royal Studies Journal, Dr. Ellie Woodacre. So if you'd like to join in the discussion, you can do so via Slido by clicking the link which is in the YouTube description below, or you can use the code BBTV. Robert, what does the Queen actually do, and has her role changed over the past 7 decades?
The Queen has two main functions. So constitutionally, she's head of state, and in that capacity, she opens Parliament every year. She appoints the Prime Minister and all the other ministers. She appoints the senior judges on the advice of the Prime Minister. She receives incoming heads of state on state visits, and until very recently undertook state visits abroad. She's no longer doing long-distance overseas travel, understandably, given her age. But also she's head of the nation. And in that capacity, she reflects the nation to itself. She represents us, her people. And to give you one example of her acting as head of the nation, at the beginning of the coronavirus epidemic in the spring of 2020, she gave a very unusual television broadcast, in effect, to rally and to comfort her people. And intriguingly, the other monarchs in Western Europe, because we're not the only monarchy, there are half a dozen other monarchies in Northwestern Europe, they all did the same. So that's a recognized role for a monarch as head of the nation in times of crisis and in times of celebration, to speak for and to the people.
Yes, and that was the day that actually the Prime Minister was taken into intensive care. So while the Queen was delivering that address, our political leader was going into very serious condition in hospital. Ellie, so the Queen has been on the throne for 70 years, and public support for her is as high as ever, more or less. Is the monarchy secure for future generations?
That's very difficult to predict. I mean, obviously, in the Queen's lifetime, I think that people's personal admiration and respect for the Queen as an individual, whatever they might feel about the institution, has really been important to securing the throne during her lifetime. After the Queen passes, obviously, it's very difficult to predict. We don't have a crystal ball. I think obviously there is a huge groundswell of support for the monarchy to continue, but there are also calls for republics, and there are obviously changes afoot in the Commonwealth as well. So we will have to see. But I think that monarchy obviously has a millennia of several millennia, if you like, of historical background and foundation here in Britain. So I think that it is quite likely that it will continue. But of course, we can never be sure how secure the monarchy will be in the long term.
Yes, and one of the people calling for a republic is Graham. So Graham, the Queen's personal popularity is huge. I think even ardent Republicans would acknowledge that. But do you think that personal popularity is maybe masking an underlying insecurity for the institution? And as a campaigner for a republic, do you consider that point of succession as almost your moment to strike?
Well, I mean, firstly, let's say that the Queen's popularity is hugely overstated. I mean, we did some polling at the time of the Harry-Meghan wedding, which tried to get into some of the detail about how strongly people felt. Now, yes, it's high, but when we asked people, you know, how much do you like the Queen? You know, the sort of people that were very enamored with her and very excited about her was a minority. And most people are happy to concede that, you know, she's done okay. She hasn't completely fouled up the job. It sort of depends on how you interpret that role, I suppose, as to how you judge it. But I mean, there are plenty of elected heads of state, particularly in places like Ireland, and Iceland, Finland, and so on, who enjoy similar levels of popularity during their terms of office. But I do think that the point that Ellie made is quite important, that the way in which people think about the Queen is hugely significant to the survival of the monarchy. And when the Queen is gone, the monarchy is going to be in very serious trouble, because, you know, we have a situation where, you know, most of us can't remember a time without the Queen being on the throne. And that reaches back to a time of greater deference, and we have generated this habit of not feeling able to criticize our own head of state, to challenge what she does, to treat her in the way that we would, say, a head of government. Now, none of that carries over to Charles. Now, Charles is open to criticism and challenge. So for the first time, we will have a monarch who is not widely respected, who is open to challenge and criticism, and who has done what the Queen has never done, which is routinely speak out and give us his opinions. And the moment you do that, you divide opinion as to whether he's doing a good job or not. And he's trying to paint his environmentalism significant and unifying and so on. But that is also divisive, because it's a hugely divisive and difficult issue to grapple with. So he is going to invite huge amounts of problems. Now, when the Queen is gone, it is going to be King Charles, Prince William, and that's it that anybody knows or recognises. And on the fringes, as a constant reminder of other problems that they have, Prince Harry on one side and Prince Andrew on the other side.
We'll come to that. But I'm curious, though, as an active campaigner for a republic, when the Queen dies, is that the point at which you think that you're going to be able to make some progress? Will you be campaigning quite vigorously at that point, or are you worried about insensitivity around the Queen's death?
I mean, after the funeral, but certainly.
Yeah, of course, I'm sure.
Let's be clear. King Charles will be campaigning to shore up his support from day one. You know, it's already been suggested that he will be touring the country the moment that his mother has died, which seems a little odd. But certainly in the run-up to the coronation, we will be campaigning very hard. And I think that whether that succeeds in those 6 months or in the following 12 months or whatever, the game has completely changed from that moment. It is completely different. And, you know, even notions that have been put around for the last 20 years about, you know, William taking over and so on, no, he will be probably in his 60s before he gets anywhere near the throne. So we're going to have this continuous succession of Charles, William, and then George, who will all be relatively old by the time they get anywhere near the top job. And all of them will be people that we are absolutely happy to criticise and challenge, not just Republicans, but people who have any opinion on what they say and do.
Yeah, I think maybe the oldest was William IV, apart from Charles. Robert, what would you consider to be sort of the highlights and lowlights of the past 70 years for the Queen?
Well, the Queen herself has talked about her annus horribilis.
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact year. I think it was in the early 1990s.
Yeah.
And of the highlights, well, possibly her jubilees. I still have very fond memories of the 1977 Jubilee, when we had big party and barbecues in our village. And my village in Oxfordshire is planning 3 days of celebrations in June for the Platinum Jubilee. So I think those are amongst the highlights.
And Ellie, as a historian, and you study queens in particular, that's one of your special interests, how do you think historians in 100 years, 200 years will judge the Queen's reign?
I think very positively. I mean, obviously, the fact that she's had such a long reign and that society itself has changed so much over the course, between 1952 and the present, and that she has managed to steer the ship of monarchy through that kind of ever-evolving change. I mean, look at the differences in terms of the sexual revolution, in terms of, again, society itself is completely kind of reshaped and reformed, and yet monarchy has endured. And I think that is part of kind of when monarchy is successful, it's because it's able to get that balance right. Monarchy lives by tradition and precedent, and that kind of ability to kind of look backwards. But at the same time, if it can't look forward and if it can't evolve, it can't survive. And if there's too great a disconnect, if you like, between the present day and the kind of history and tradition of monarchy, it falls apart. And I think the Queen's greatest success, in a way, has been maintaining that balance, again, upholding the tradition, upholding the kind of reverence that comes from, again, that millennia of being kind of part of our framework, but at the same time making adjustments, accepting that there is change and integrating that into how the monarchy operates. And I think that's what she's really gotten right.
I come back on this idea of the highlights, the lowlights, and the Queen's reign. I mean, it's not an achievement to reign for 70 years. If you're given a job for life at the age of 25 and you're still alive at the age of 95, you've had a job for 70 years, and that's just mathematics. It's not an achievement. And the survival of the monarchy has as much to do with the deference and the secrecy and the unwillingness of people to challenge and take to task the royal household on a whole range of issues. When they the notion that they change or reform, they change their PR, they don't change the institution. And when outsiders who do want to do things differently, as we found with Diana and more recently Meghan, come in, they cannot fit in because they don't want to change. And the Queen particularly is known for wanting everything to stay exactly the same as much as possible and resists change. Now, that secrecy and that deference are the biggest factors, and the fact that the monarchy serves the interests of the politicians. Politicians, once they get into government, they can use the Crown's powers at will, which are excessive and highly centralised, and they do not, even if they are inclined to support getting rid of those powers or getting rid of the monarchy before they get into power. Once they're in power, they're happy to use those powers and don't feel the need to rock the boat and cause any trouble by raising this issue. So there are lots of harder sort of political factors here. And when we look at the reign, the idea that in 70 years, the highlight might be that some people had a party to celebrate this person. All of this conversation about the Queen's reign and about what she's done, it's all about what she's done for her position and the position of her family. But there's very little that is concrete that she has done that people can point to, speeches that she's made, contributions to public life, contributions to shaping these huge changes that have happened. And in that time, other countries, like Ireland and Iceland and Finland and Austria, have elected a succession of people, some of whom have been absolutely exceptional and have enjoyed as high polling ratings. And have been historic in themselves, such as, I'm going to get the name wrong, but Vigdis Finnbogadóttir of Iceland, who was the first woman ever to be elected as head of state.
Sorry, I do think you have a point. Certainly, scandal involving Meghan Markle and accusations of racism certainly seem to have damaged the popularity of the royal family with younger people in particular. But I do want to turn to how the royal family might try to reform itself, or you might say change its PR, however you want to frame it. Looking at the future King Charles, so Robert, you've written about how monarchies maintain themselves, and you said that the royal family shouldn't be too big. And that they should, keep it small in order to avoid controversy by extended members of the royal family. Do you think that Charles would be right to slim down the monarchy when he becomes king, as has been reported?
I think it will slim down, partly naturally, because if you look at the court circular and count the number of members of the royal family who carry out public engagements, it's currently 12 people. But from memory, almost half of them are people in their 70s and 2 of them are in their 80s. And therefore, when Charles becomes king, the more elderly members of the royal family will have retired. Some of them may have died. So I think it's quite natural that in 10 years or so, we're likely to have a royal team of only half a dozen rather than a dozen. That will cause small difficulty because the demand for royal visits, Graham may not like this, but it's true, is much greater than the supply. Talk to any Lord Lieutenant in a county about the number of requests they get from charities, from hospitals, from other public services for a royal visit to open a new building or to celebrate their anniversary or whatever it may be. And there is much more demand, even than can be fulfilled with the present team. So public expectations, I think, will have to be managed and be reduced. With a smaller royal team, we'll have fewer royals carrying out those public engagements.
Well, I mean, I would just take.
Oh, sorry, I just want to bring in Ellie. Sorry, Graham. But I mean, since the 16th century, the British monarchy has largely been defined by its position at the head of the Church of England. And as the UK becomes more secularized, might the monarchy become less exclusively Anglican? There have been reports that Charles might adopt the title of Defender of Faith rather than Defender of the Faith.
No, I think that's a very interesting question. And again, that is something that where we can see kind of shift and change is that the monarchy has been not exclusively kind of attending or being involved in events that are connected to the Anglican Church. So you're right, obviously, from the break with Rome, obviously, we've had this kind of Defender of the Faith kind of scenario where the monarchy has also been the head of the Anglican Church. That decoupling is certainly possible, or perhaps just a more kind of open framework, if you like you said, this idea that he might be defender of faith or faiths rather than defender of the faith, i.e. the Anglican Church. So that is certainly in today's secular and multi-faith society, I think that is perhaps a very wise reframing, if you like, of that connection.
I suppose part of what monarchists might think of as the magic of monarchy is that it is sacral. So does that undermine that sacral nature of the monarchy if you start to decouple it from the church?
Not necessarily. I mean, you're absolutely right. And that is kind of one of the kind of key tenets of monarchy. If you go right back even to the kind of ancient era, if you like, is this connection with the divine in some way, shape or form. So it is a significant element. But obviously the exact kind of connection between the Anglican faith in particular is something, like I said, that we can see particularly from the break with Rome. And I think that it is, like I said, today in society that it is probably a wise thing, like I said, to be accepting of and see themselves as connected with people of all faiths and none, rather than exclusively just a defender of the Anglican faith.
And Graham, the Republican cause has had some success this past year with Barbados becoming a republic. Do you anticipate more countries in the Commonwealth will follow Barbados and become republics in the coming years? Of course, there's been clamours for it in Australia and Jamaica and other parts of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, I mean, a leading politician, I think it was in Jamaica just the other week, said that in the next 10 years, there'll be another 8 Caribbean countries ditching the monarchy. But I mean, I think that's inevitable. Most Commonwealth countries are republics. Over 95% of the population of the Commonwealth live in republics or don't have the Queen as their head of state. So, it is only really in Britain and in the imaginations of the royals, the Commonwealth is closely linked to the British monarch. It just isn't. I mean, it's an independent international intergovernmental organisation. But if I can just come back on a couple of the other points, because this idea of slimming down the monarchy, and yes, there might be a lot of letters going in saying, can we have a royal visit? But royal visits don't take up a lot of the royals' time. I mean, if you actually add up the hours they do doing royal visits, it adds up to sort of full-time work equivalent to about 2 months, if that. Some of them quite a bit less than that. So the idea that they couldn't take up the slack with a few less people simply isn't true. They do very little throughout the year, given how much money we throw at them. And the problem with the slimming down argument is that it might reduce the number of people and therefore reduce the number of potential targets for criticism and scandal. It won't reduce the cost of it, and it won't tackle any of the issues around secrecy, abuse of power, inappropriate lobbying and so on and so forth. The cost is going to keep on going up because that's the way that the funding is arranged. So, and on the faith, we shouldn't have someone defending faith in a country where most people don't have faith. And Charles certainly isn't going to be defending those of no faith. He's made that quite clear.
May I chip in here on 2 points?
Yeah, go for it.
Firstly, on other Commonwealth countries becoming republics, that's entirely a matter for them. And the monarchy has always made it crystal clear that if Australia or Jamaica or any other country which currently is a monarchy wants to become a republic, they are completely free to do so. My hunch is that privately, Buckingham Palace might even welcome that, because it actually adds to the burden of being monarch that the Queen currently is the monarch of some 14 other countries, as well as the UK. And being a conscientious monarch, it's a duty that she takes seriously, trying to keep on top of politics and the issues in all the other countries of which she is formerly the head of state. So slimming down in that respect, I think, would not necessarily be unwelcome. The second point, and this is a really important one, is that things like the cost of the monarchy, the links of the monarchy to the church, the secrecy or not of the monarchy are all the responsibility of the government, not of the monarchy. It's the government that funds the monarchy. The government, if it wishes, could reduce the cost of the monarchy. The links to the church are formalized through the accession and coronation oaths, which Charles will take when he becomes king. Those are statutory oaths. They can only be changed by Parliament. And therefore, it's a matter for the government, if it chooses, to weaken or to break that link. So these are all things which we collectively are responsible for through our elected government. We shouldn't necessarily place responsibility for these things at the doors of the monarchy.
Graham, I'll let Graham come in briefly, but then we'll move on to the next bit.
Very quickly, because this is a long-standing habit of people who support the monarchy, is to shift all responsibility well away from the Queen. Now, the Queen is the head of the monarchy, she's the head of the royal household, and there is ample evidence that they proactively lobby for secrecy, for greater secrecy, for, they had themselves, the protection from freedom of information requests extended after that law came in. They lobby for changes to royal funding. They routinely use public money for private things. No, they have a responsibility to live up to the standards that we expect of other public institutions, and they do not live up to those standards. So, to simply say that it's up to everybody else, they are responsible for their own actions and for their own unwillingness to take responsibility for those actions.
So, Ross, say the Queen's no longer here. We've got a republic. The Queen is currently central to our constitution, at least in the way it's presented. What would a British republic even look like?
It would be very similar to what we have now. In effect, we have a republican system of government dressed in the clothes of monarchy. And if we became a republic, the head of state would perform exactly the same functions as the Queen does. The big debate would be, how do we appoint or elect that head of state? And that is what has dogged the debate, for example, in Australia, when they had a referendum in 1999 on whether to become a republic. They couldn't decide, or they couldn't agree upon how the new head of state should be appointed. And that's a really important constitutional question.
This is not an accurate portrayal of what a republic is and how it differs to the monarchy. The Queen's job is to do one thing and one thing only, which is exactly what she's told to do by the Prime Minister. And as we saw with the prorogation in 2019, she's told to do something regardless of whether it's unconstitutional or not, if the Prime Minister tells her to do it. In a republic, you have an independent head of state, and quite often they are directly elected, as they are in Finland, Iceland, Austria and Ireland, for example. And they have a similar role to the Queen if you take the Queen's role as being independent and serious, as opposed to in the pocket of the Prime Minister. But they are independent and able to act, exercise their limited reserve powers independently of government and Parliament, as the Irish President has done on a number of occasions when they've declined to sign a law because they believe it contradicts the Constitution. So it is a fundamentally different role in that it is a role that is independent. The Queen does not do anything that is not requested of her by the Prime Minister, except for there have been a particularly infamous case in Australia where she ignored the Prime Minister and instead took the advice of the Governor General and sacked the Prime Minister in what was a wholly unconstitutional action. But again, the secrecy blurred all the lines. All the blame was shifted to other people, and it's only 40 years later that we find out what actually happened back then.
I think if I could just come in briefly as a historian, obviously, you know, I'm coming at this as someone who just studies the framework. I mean, I think it's often forgotten that we did have a period as a republic, which was an unsuccessful experiment, but it was a very interesting time. But one of the reasons why it was not necessarily a successful interlude in our history was because it was unclear the framework that we were going to use, and that debate and dissent within Parliament itself as to how it was going to frame itself was part of the reason why it was not successful. So I think if we did move in that direction, I think the most important thing would be to make sure that the framework was very clear in terms of how it would be achieved so that it could be successful. And I think obviously one of the things we have to consider is the way that things are currently framed. The royal prerogative is kind of at its heart. So we would have to, again, kind of reimagine and reframe how things work in order to make sure it's successful. I mean, again, this is not a comment on whether or not we should be a republic. I'm just saying, as a historian, looking at the reasons why the previous Republican kind of moment, if you like, was not a success. It was that lack of clarity and lack of agreement over how an English republic would look.
They had also a constitution of the institutions of government, but which did inspire the American colonists. But yeah, sorry, go on, Graham.
It wasn't a simple failure of the system. I mean, this is 350 years ago. We were talking about an entirely different world. You know, since then, we've had 350 years of history in which monarchies have collapsed right across Europe and elsewhere in the world, and they have fantastically failed, and have had a pretty big part in playing in the chaos of two world wars. And since the Second World War, most countries in Europe have become or have stayed democratic republics. It's not a complicated thing to do and to shift to, as Ireland has shown us, as Iceland has shown us when they ditched the monarchy in 1944. So, you know, what happened in the 17th century really isn't particularly relevant, because, you know, the main failure there was that it was a much more immature political culture, and there was a counter coup staged by the royalists when once Cromwell was gone. That is why the monarchy came back.
It is quite a complicated thing. In fact, actually, Alice Hunt is writing a fantastic book about it at the moment. So she would be definitely a great person to kind of talk to. But again, I was just kind of pointing out that this is one of the things that we have to think about if we're going to make a considerable shift in the way our whole government is framed and run. It needs to be a carefully considered exercise. And that's what I'm saying in terms of not necessarily saying we shouldn't have a republic or we can't have a republic. It's just any major shift of that nature has to be very carefully considered, and there has to be consensus about how that's formed.
Yes, now I love talking about the 17th century, but we are deviating a bit. So finally, just a final question for you all. Hilliary Mantel, the novelist, made headlines not too long ago when she claimed that Prince George would not end up on the throne, and that potentially William would be the last king. Quick fire, Robert first, do you think she's right or wrong?
I think she's wrong. Let me make two quick points. One, all monarchies ultimately depend on the support of the people, and our monarchy will only survive if it continues to command popular support. Second point, there's a lazy assumption that the highest form of democracy has to be a republic. Not so. Every year, the Economist Intelligence Unit publish a league table of the top democracies in the world. Every year, the list is topped by countries like Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, New Zealand. What are these countries? They're all monarchies. And therefore, there's nothing incompatible between being a monarchy and being a very successful form of democracy.
And Ellie?
I think she may be wrong. Obviously, like I said, it's very hard crystal ball. I wouldn't like to predict, but given the monarchy's history and its ability to weather the storms and many serious storms, including, as we were just saying, regicide and a moment of republicanism, I would probably be betting on it to continue.
And finally, Graham, do you think you'll get your wish?
Yes, I do, and I think that the thing about all these international rankings, we're not in the top 10, we're not in the top 20 for quite a lot of them. Our democracy is pretty shockingly poor, and we've only really been a democracy since the 1920s, if you think that that's when most adults were able to vote. And during most of the time since, we've had Queen Elizabeth, whose reign has stretched from this time of great deference to the modern era, where everybody wants their views heard. Everybody wants to debate things on social media and so on. we are now in a very different world, and I think there's going to be a sudden jarring shock when we suddenly find that we have a king on the throne, not the Queen, someone who is wide open to criticism and challenge. And I think that the other thing is that Prince Harry has shown Prince George that actually you don't need to put up with all this tedium. You can go and have a better life in, on the beaches of California if you wish to do so. So I think that I wouldn't be surprised if Prince George doesn't want the job. They are shrinking. They're running out of people and stars and all the rest of it. They've got these problems on either side of them with Harry and Andrew, and there is now a much more active, robust democracy and a much more active and robust opposition. And I think that they would be lucky to get very far past the reign of King Charles.
I'm glad we've had some healthy disagreement. Thank you very much to Robert, Ellie and Graham for joining me today. We really appreciate your time. And I believe our next episode is going to be on the police. So for all of you watching, have a great rest of your week and goodbye.